Welcome, everyone, to the Weinberg Group webinar entitled Drug Safety 2011, What You Need to Know, Bleak House or Great Expectations. All participants' lines will be on a listen-only mode throughout the program. However, if you would like to submit a question or comment to the presenters, click the button marked Ask a Question on your event window and submit your question. All questions will be answered via email within a week of the presentation. To start, I would like to turn the conference over to Mr. Antos. Mr. Antos, please go ahead.
Good morning and good afternoon, everybody, and thank you for joining our webinar. I'm Jeff Antos from the Weinberg Group, and I'll be moderating today's session entitled Drug Safety 2011, What You Need to Know, Bleak House or Great Expectations. The Weinberg Group is a regulatory and scientific consulting firm serving pharma, biotech, and device clients. We're headquartered in Washington, D.C. It's a special privilege for me to introduce today's speaker, Dr. Bart Cobert. I first worked with Bart more than a decade ago when he was the global head of pharmacovigilance for Schering-Plough Research Institute. He's held similar positions at Novartis Consumer Health and Metadata Solutions and has dedicated more than 30 years to clinical research, pharmacovigilance, drug safety, and risk management. Bart's a global lecturer and a trainer and author of 4 books on drug safety. He's an MD from NYU, where he also completed his internship and residency, which was followed by a hepatology postdoc in Paris. He's board certified in internal medicine and gastroenterology. Currently, he's on the staff at his alma mater, the NYU School of Medicine, and the University of Medicine and Dentistry of New Jersey. Bart is president of his own company, BLCMD Associated LLC, and is a consultant to the Weinberg Group. I'll turn it over to Bart now.
Thanks, Jeff. Good day, everybody. Good day. I have a big agenda here I want to go through. You can see that on your screen. I'm going to talk briefly about how drug safety is done, how things are changing, what's causing the changes, and how we may see a major impact in the United States and globally due to changes in the environment. Brief review of the new FDA policy and actions, and then what you should be doing now, and a quick review of some major risks, particularly to the executives of your companies. So how is drug safety done? There are basically 2 ways drug safety is done. The first way is before the marketing of the product, and that's a pre-marketing clinical trial stage with reporting of adverse events by the investigators to the company and then by the companies to FDA, EMEA, and the other health authorities, as well as the ethics committee and review boards. After marketing, it's a totally different situation. That's when we rely primarily on a spontaneous reporting system. Before marketing, you may or may not know that only a small number of patients are studied. The recommendations from ICH are basically for chronic conditions. Only 1,500 patients need to be studied, of which 300 to 600 would go for 6 months, and only 100 for 1 year. Now, these may be drugs that will be used for a lifetime, such as hypertension or diabetes drugs. So in grand total, before a drug is on the market, you may see no more than 5,000 or 10,000 patients exposed to the drug. In some cases, particularly orphan drugs, I've seen as few as 200 patients exposed to the drug. So with these numbers of patients exposed, it's clear that you do not have a good safety profile of the drug. With 100 or even 5,000 patients, you will not pick up the rare adverse events. How many patients would you need to pick up the rare adverse event? Well, if you're looking at something, say a heart attack, something like a heart attack, which occurs at the rate of, say, 1 in 50,000 patients, you would need to study 3 times that number, 150,000 patients, to be 95% certain that you'll pick up the problem. Clearly, we cannot study 150,000 or more patients before marketing. And if you're talking about even more rare adverse events, the 1 in a million, we clearly cannot study 3 million patients before marketing. In the post-marketing arena, as I mentioned, The system is primarily based on the voluntary, spontaneous reporting of side effects from physicians, pharmacists, nurses, and other healthcare personnel, as well as the patients and the consumers who use the drugs. More recently, there has been a push by FDA and the Europeans and the Canadians to require some post-marketing commitments. They might be registries, studies, enhanced reporting of adverse events, or other elements that will improve the safety of patients. So does this system work? Does voluntary reporting work? Well, I did my own very unofficial test of this, doing a Google search, and I Googled FDA and success, and I got 13.7 million hits. And then when I Googled FDA plus failure, I got 14 million hits. So this is roughly 50-50. So it seems, at least, if you use my very unscientific, unofficial Google search mechanism, we have a half-and-half breakdown as to whether the system works. Those who feel the current system works would say, of course it works. For not much money, we're voluntarily picking up rare and serious adverse events, which, if we needed to do a study of 250,000 people, would cost a fortune. This is a rational use of resources, people, and money, and it allows us to withdraw drugs or change drug labeling based on medical evidence. This is a success, and the system works. On the other hand, some people say, are you kidding? This is a disaster. This isn't a system. It relies on the luck and goodwill of people reporting side effects. And if they're too busy or too harried or feel they're going to be sued, they won't report side effects. This is hardly scientific, and it's hardly systematic. In addition, it can take years to pick up an adequate number of cases to discover a problem. This will produce much suffering and many deaths. And heaven knows what's happening out there now on drugs we have no reports on, in particular old drugs. So it pays your money and takes your choice on this. Now, there are many philosophic changes in drug safety because probably the failure view is more prevalent. Many people feel the current system is not, in particular, very adequate. And there's been a paradigm shift to a certain degree. In the old days, drugs were basically felt to be safe and effective and thus put on the market. This is changing. It's much more nuanced than that. People now are understanding that all drugs have safety risks, and these risks have to be characterized, and these risks change over time. And the new buzzword, the new paradigm, is drug life cycle risk management. What you want to do here now over the course of the life cycle of the drug is to early on, just as the drug is moving into clinical trials, try to predict as best you can the toxicity in humans based on animal data. And you'll have some clues in the animal and the carcinogenicity data as to what organs are most at risk for the drug. You then build safety measures into the early phase 1 and phase 2 trials based on the animal and preclinical data. These safety measures should now be tracked carefully and used in further studies in phase 3. In particular, one must now track all drugs during their development for new, unexpected, or increasing side effects. This should be built into the protocol, and expected rates, where possible, of side effects should be built into the protocol so you can track increases in these serious events. Then, of course, you need to track safety issues after marketing. This is risk management. Then you must do things to minimize risk minimization, whether you have a REMS in place or not. I'll talk a little more about REMS later. The FDA has introduced a new concept called Elements to Assure Safe Use, ETASUs. These are things that companies will do during marketing, and they include registries, long-term safety studies, special communications, med guides, etc., and I'll talk a little more about them later. And then finally, we have post-marketing commitments and FDA-mandated REMS, risk evaluation and minimization systems. Similar systems are required in the European Union, where they're called RMPs, risk management or minimization plans. And we also have similar requirements in many other countries, and they're increasing weekly. Japan, Canada, Australia, and many others have now introduced this concept and have requirements. Interestingly, the requirements may vary from country to country or region to region, so that the REMS or RMP you put in place may not be fully adequate for another geographic region, producing overlap and multiple risk management plans. One of the reasons we are paying a lot more attention is that it used to be felt that the safety profile of a drug would largely be picked up early on, shortly after the marketing of the product, maybe within a year or two or three. But this very dramatic slide, which is an FDA slide, puts that in question. What you're seeing here is a chart of changes to the label, safety changes to the labeling of drugs approved in the United States. And these include black box warnings, warnings in general, precautions, contraindications, and new side effects. And on the x-axis on the bottom is years since approval of the NDA, and we're talking about some 1,600 NDAs or BLAs. And on the left side, on the y-axis, is the number of changes. The bottom axis is by years. So if you look at the far right, you will see some changes to product labeling in regard to safety 60 years after the drug was approved. This is incredible when you think about it. We clearly do not know the safety profile of the drug early on, and you can even argue we never know the full safety profile of the drug. Why is this? Well, patients may change, indications may change, and drug interactions may change as new drugs come on the market. So if you look at this chart, you'll see a bunching of the changes on the left side with a peak at around 5 years. So you need very constant and strong vigilance for safety through at least 10 years where you will see the majority of the changes occurring. Then you will see a slow but steady drop-off over the next several decades. But still, widely used drugs such as warfarin, even 30 or 40 or 50 years after approval, are still seeing significant changes in the labeling. And this is a very important public health point, which means that we really need to do continuous and continual drug safety monitoring. There are a lot of drivers for change. Part of them are public, part of them are from the government. Firstly, we're seeing a larger number of serious adverse events, and there's been a lot of speculation on this. Is it better pickup, or are our drugs more toxic, or are they being given to sicker people? And you can debate this back and forth, but nonetheless, we are seeing more side effects. The public is angry. The public is asking for change. There have been too many drug withdrawals, too many unhappy people paying what they perceive as large amounts of money for drugs that hurt them. There has been a lot of publicity with the internet, blogs, the social media, and this has produced a revolution in communications that everybody is struggling with. FDA is formulating some new guidelines, which they have not yet released, on how to handle social media. Many companies, plus FDA, are now tweeting and have Facebook pages. So we are going to see a real change in the way communications occur thanks to the internet. Many people have been upset with the significant drug toxicity, which has produced a lot of morbidity and mortality, leading to a lot more drug withdrawals. And FDA has an RSS feed of withdrawals and recalls each week, and they number in the dozens to hundreds weekly. There have been a fair amount of bad actions and bad behavior by the pharmaceutical industry. In addition, in the U.S., there are legal and financial reasons that have produced significant effect on the industry, forcing it to change. There has been pressure from other health agencies who are more proactive than the actions in the United States. In particular, we're seeing the MHRA in the UK being very proactive and in some cases acting first before FDA or other agencies. There have been multiple scandals around the world. There is now a controversy, arguably scandal, going on in France about a weight loss drug for diabetes that allegedly produced 500 deaths in France and was slow to be taken off the market. The head of drug safety in France has just resigned, and there are going to be some changes in the French health authority. So we are seeing an international change and an international awareness of drug safety. In general, health authorities have been in a reactive mode. They have left drug safety to others, to the drug companies, to WHO, and have tended to be reactive. This is changing. There is little research on drug safety technique and methodology. We are largely where we were 20 or 30 years ago. This is starting to change. There is little academic interest in drug safety. You will not see much drug safety research coming out of medical schools or pharmacy schools. In the United States, but now more so in Europe, there is a lot of litigation, in particular class action suits. Class action suits are now spreading to Europe, and we're going to see more and more of them. In addition, the final driver for change is ethical and moral. It's the right thing to do. If we're giving drugs to people, we really do need to pay attention to the safety aspects. And this has made for a media circus in many regards. You have seen perhaps some major headlines in newspapers, just a couple here on the screen. In training video, Merck said Vioxx did not increase risk of heart attack. For Merck, the Vioxx paper trail won't go away. Drug files show maker pursued unapproved indications, promoted unapproved indications. Drug makers pay for lunch as they pitch doctors. This is the famous lunch that is given to many physicians and nurses and pharmacists so that the drugs can be detailed. Psychiatrists top list in drug makers' gifts. GSK concealed negative Avandia study. And this has all produced a very negative wave of publicity for the industry, which has produced a terrible drop in the industry's perception in the eyes of the public. For an industry that doesn't make guns or cigarettes or cars that get 5 miles per gallon, the pharmaceutical industry is now placed in the category of these companies. And I don't know how we got into this position, but we have managed to do so. There's now more and more oversight, and there are more and more inspections by governments. There are several reasons for this. Firstly, it's a way of keeping the companies honest to make sure they're doing the right thing. But what is most interesting and most important, except for the United States, just about every country now doing inspections, drug safety inspections, GMP inspections, charges for them. So if you have a drug safety inspection by one of the European agencies, for example, this can cost you upwards of $15,000 to $25,000 or euros to have this inspection. So inspections are now becoming a profit center for companies, for governments, and they are making money on inspections. In addition, of course, they are picking up problems within the industry. About a year and a half ago, FDA enunciated a new inspection policy, and this was from Joshua Sharfstein, who was then the Deputy Commissioner of FDA, and he talked about 4 strategies focusing on prevention, enhancing regulatory information, improving FDA's scientific and analytic capabilities, and finally doing risk-based inspection and enforcement. And this will be an integrated approach by FDA to improve medical product as well as food safety. There has been a parallel track in this for food safety in addition. So FDA is developing a modern risk-based pharmaceutical quality assessment system focusing on quality attributes and quality management systems and how they relate to drug safety and effectiveness. The British also, the MHRA, have developed a compliance report in which they inspect companies that they perceive to be at higher risk than other companies for having problems. And this includes both dangerous drugs, sick patients, but operational issues within the company, such as high turnover of employees, which may put the company at risk for an inspection. And it's well worth taking a look at the MHRA website in the UK to see how they do pharmacovigilance inspections. They are now very aggressive in inspecting, and they will inspect you first and more quickly and more thoroughly if they perceive your company is not doing drug safety as well as it should. Who can be inspected? Pretty much anybody. The FDA has hired more inspectors. They have set up offices in South and Central America as well as Asia, and they can inspect companies, be it headquarters or regional offices, anywhere where side effects come from. They can inspect partners, distributors, co-developers, licensees, licensors, co-marketers, vendors, contractors, suppliers. They look at data storage facilities, CROs, and investigator sites. Similarly, the Europeans do the same thing, and more countries are doing inspections. India will be starting inspections outside India at some point, they claim soon. And you are seeing also that Canada will be inspecting outside of Canada at some point soon also. When they find something, sanctions range from a requirement to correct bad practices through a CAPA, a corrective action, preventive action plan, to warning letters to the most severe, which is withdrawal of your product from the market. And this is occurring more frequently than it did in the past. In addition, Dr. Margaret Hamburg, who's the commissioner of FDA, made some statements also about a year and a half ago. She agrees that the FDA enforcement efforts have been deficient and there will be better enforcement in order to protect the public health, to deter others from potentially violating the law. They want to communicate these issues to the public to increase their standing in the public. They want to create a level playing field for industry so that everybody is held to the same standards. And they want to increase public confidence in FDA, which has not been as high as it could be or should be. So what will be done? Well, FDA is now doing regular inspections and follow-ups, roughly on a 2 to 3 year basis of pharmaceutical companies, more frequently when appropriate. There is a greater emphasis on violations with meaningful penalties to, quote, send a strong message to discourage future offenses. There will be rapid action by FDA, particularly for egregious violations, and we're seeing more and more withdrawals, and for violations that threaten the public health. The violations are visible. FDA is now tweeting and putting out many press releases and RSS feeds. Pharma companies are obliged then to act quickly and thoroughly to correct practices. They must also be proactive to pick up things. You really do not want an agency to pick up a problem before you. You should be doing internal surveillance. You should have an internal quality management system to pick up issues before the health authorities do. So Dr. Hamburg has stated that we should understand that violators will be caught. If you cross the line, you will be caught, and you will be punished. Failure to act will produce significant enforcement and penalties. FDA has already changed its warning letter process. They are now putting out warning letters more quickly and more freely with less internal review and less back and forth with the companies. If you are inspected and if you get a 483 form showing violations from FDA, you now must respond within 15 business days. Previously, you did not need to respond, although most people did. In addition, warning letters are coming more frequently. And in May of last year, for example, FDA issued a 15-page warning letter to Pfizer in regard to some deficiencies in their drug safety system. FDA, in addition, is working jointly with regulatory partners, both internationally, where they hold teleconferences or video conferences with their counterparts in Europe and other countries, particularly English-speaking countries. FDA is now working more closely with state and local agencies within the United States, and they are coordinating better than they did in the past. In addition, as noted, they now have regional offices with native speakers in China and other parts of Asia, as well as Latin and Central America. I'd like to do a little aside here on the concept of the qualified person for pharmacovigilance. This is a European concept. There's starting to be a little bit of talk about this in other countries, and the concept is basically that you have one-stop shopping, one single person who is responsible for drug safety within a company. And this can be a very onerous and difficult job. This is the law in Europe. It's in Volume 9A. And basically this is a requirement that every marketing authorization holder, which is to say the NDA holder in Europe, must have a permanently and continuously based at their disposal person residing in the European Union or EFTA who is charged with establishing and maintaining the company's entire safety system. He or she must have an overview of the safety profile and emerging safety issues for all of the company's products. He or she must ensure that all serious adverse events are collected and reported to the health authorities, must ensure that the preparation of the periodic safety reports, the PSURs, are done, has to answer questions from the health authorities or ensure that they are answered, has to ensure that a quality control and QA system is in place with key performance indicators, that is, metrics, being tracked. The person must ensure that there are written SOPs in place and that they're being followed. The QP must also ensure that there is a good database, that operations are continuous, that it's 24/7, and that validation has been done. He or she must also ensure that any contracts with co-marketers, licensees, distributors, etc., arrange for the reporting of side effects and other safety issues. There must be a signal identification, analysis, and workup mechanism in place. There must be a labeling mechanism in place to ensure that changes get told to the public through the official media of the label. There must be a risk management system and RMP system in place if required by the agencies. There must be a crisis management business continuity plan in place that is tested periodically. If trials are underway, the qualified person must be aware of what they are and what they are showing in regard to safety. He or she must also ensure that safety training is done of all appropriate personnel. And he or she must also sign off personally on the reports submitted to the agencies. He or she must also ensure that internal audits are done periodically and that the company be ready for inspections by governmental authorities. The QP is usually, but not always, an MD. If it's not an MD, he or she must have an MD available immediately, and this person is registered with the EMEA. Well, as you can imagine, this is an enormous job. It can be very difficult, particularly in a big company. This person must be empowered, and if he or she fails at it, both he or she and the company are at risk for civil and criminal penalties. This concept has now been talked about for the United States, not necessarily called a QP, qualified person, but one where we will have a responsible party who signs off taking on the personal and corporate responsibility for all of these items. Whether this will come about remains to be seen. In addition, in the world of drug safety, we are seeing some very significant IT issues. There is not, perhaps to our surprise, a single definitive global safety database for adverse events. The closest thing we have is the WHO database in Uppsala, Sweden, which has several million cases. However, these cases come from individual governments, and it's not an independent database collecting data on its own. It is collecting feeds from governments. The feeds are incomplete. They do not have narratives, for example. So we do not have one good, solid global database for adverse events. The FDA maintains one, also with several million cases, and this is available through Freedom of Information, and database extracts are available on the FDA's website. There is also Vigilance, a big database within Europe. This database is not yet available, though, to the public. I expect that we will see major changes in the database and in information technology as the world moves toward electronic health records. There is a clear move within the United States to move to this. This will probably take a decade to come to full fruition. We already have good use of electronic health records in many other countries, such as Canada, and it's going to change the way drug safety is done. But currently, we don't have a good database, and we don't have a good way of reporting serious adverse events to the database, to FDA or to the company. There are ways to do it online. It can be done by phone. It can be done by mail, but it is still a very clunky way of doing it. We do not have standards for format of reports. Ideally, the MedWatch form should be used, but that is not obligatory except for companies. We do not have standards yet for everything in regard to content or transmission of supplementary data. We do not have full IT standards. It is being worked on, but we still have a ways to go. There are significant privacy issues in the United States under HIPAA, in Europe under the Directive 9546 in regard to patient protection, and this has somehow, in some cases, prevented full transmission of safety information to the places it should go. So, what is being done? Well, there are multiple efforts around to improve the IT and the standards in the data collection. In particular, there is something called HL7, Health Level 7, the Health Level 7 Standards Organization. This is a not-for-profit standards developing organization with some 2,300 members, which is dedicated to providing a comprehensive framework and standards for the entire data system used in the health world. This will include exchange, integration, sharing, retrieval, and databasing of electronic health records, both in clinical practice and hospital use, insurance use, drug safety, and the entire system of health care, at least in the United States. We are seeing similar efforts in Europe and in other countries of varying degrees of advancement. In HL7, as I noted, there are 2,300 plus members, including 500 major corporate members, and most importantly, the FDA. So we now have a national commitment to electronic health records. Some of this is going to produce problems. For example, we have all in the industry gotten used to MEDRA as the coding mechanism for adverse events in drug safety. However, FDA and some of the Europeans are now moving towards something called SNOMED, which is another dictionary of some 400,000 terms, which is much more extensive than MEDRA, and there is a push to use this throughout North America and parts of Europe. Whether this will displace MEDRA is unclear, but it is simply another example of a change in standards in the middle of the game, which will require a lot of re-engineering of current systems. How this will play out remains to be seen. Ultimately, though, in looking 5 or 10 or 20 years down the road, one can imagine national or regional or even global databases from which one can pull adverse events rather than relying on doctors or nurses or patients supplying adverse events to a database and then uploading. So someday all of this may be algorithmed, and we will be able to get side effects pretty much in real time with good analytics being done. This is the hope. Following an investigation by the Institute of Medicine and following the Vioxx and several other scandals, the Congress in the United States passed and the President signed the FDA Revitalization Act of 2007. This act gave FDA much more power and control over certain areas of drug and food safety. In particular, it gave FDA more control over labeling, and it now required over-the-counter and food supplement serious adverse events to be reported. Quite surprisingly, before 2007, for most OTC drugs and food supplements in the United States, there was no requirement to report side effects at all to the FDA. The result of this act in 2007 is arguably slower approval of new drugs and clearly an increase in the number of drugs removed from the market by the FDA, and in parallel abroad, as other agencies tend to follow. The Act in 2007 set up the REMS system, the risk management system for new drugs, And at the request of FDA, a company must submit as part of its NDA a proposed risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, REMS as they're called. These REMS are posted on FDA's website. There are some 200 plus of them now since 2008 when this system started. And a drug is more likely to require a REMS if the size of number of people using the drug, if the number of people using the drug is large, if the disease is serious, if the drug is fairly toxic, if the expected benefit and duration of treatment is not clear or unknown, and if there are any known significant serious or potential adverse events that need to be tracked carefully. Amongst other things, this Act can require in a REMS ETASUs, as I mentioned. This could be something as simple as a patient package insert or medication guide and a communication strategy, which would be a letter or some mechanism of informing the prescriber of certain requirements for the drug. But it can be much more than that. There can be special conditions. For example, a physician might need special training or experience. Only an infectious disease person, for example, could prescribe the drug, or he or she might have to take a course of a couple of hours before prescribing the drug. There may be limited dispensing, only in certain pharmacies, for example, hospital pharmacies, or only certain prescribers can prescribe, or perhaps the drug can only be used in the inpatient setting. Previously, pretty much anybody could prescribe any drug for anything. This is becoming less and less likely. There may be obligatory testing. For example, a patient might be required to have a pregnancy test or a white blood count test, for example, before getting a drug. In addition, there may be a mandatory registry. Every patient getting the drug may be obliged to register, either with the government or with a private company that is set up to track the registry and the effectiveness and side effects. In effect, this is an observational study. Another major action of FDA is the creation of an enormous database. And FDA was mandated by this law to create a database by last year, 2010, of 25 million patients. And basically FDA has largely done this. They now have a database of some 25 million patients brought in from different groups around the United States. Originally, it was hoped that this database would be real, live, online, with real-time searching possible. But this, in the first run-through, has not been possible, and it's basically a flat database that is updated periodically. As you can imagine, bringing in this much data from multiple sources requires a lot of normalization of the data and a lot of changes in the data to get it into a database with validation and reliability. The FDA is mandated also to have 100 million patients in this database by 2012. Once this occurs and once the bugs are ironed out, we will be able to do excellent observational studies, both prospective and retrospective, and this will change the way the game is played. There will be enormous data management implications. The other interesting thing is that this will happen independently of the companies. Right now, to a large degree, the companies are the major suppliers of adverse events to the FDA. Only some 5% of the 500,000 adverse events going to FDA each year go directly to the FDA. 95% go to the companies who then send it to the FDA. This will now change. Most of the data will now reside within this big database, and the companies will not know about it and will probably be surprised. Whether this database will be made public remains to be seen. The FDA also has multiple other initiatives ongoing under the general heading of the Sentinel Initiative. As noted, there will be a big database, but in addition, FDA is creating a federal database, which is to say all of the health care done within the United States that is under governmental control, which is a surprisingly large amount, as this includes other federal agencies. It includes Medicare, which is health care for everyone over 65. It includes the many million people in the armed forces, as well as the Veterans Administration, which is to say the many million veterans. And it includes, to a certain degree, Medicaid, which is state state-by-state medical care. So the federal government is developing a database of federal information, which will also be quite interesting. It will surely be melded into the Sentinel database at some point. FDA is also redoing its AIRS database, which is the FDA Drug Safety Database, and they will have better online AE reporting for all FDA-regulated products. We are already seeing this in Europe. Many of the European countries, Australia, Canada, also have direct online reporting. We're seeing more and more drug recalls. Early data from, 2009 shows a quadrupling of the number of drug recalls in 2009 compared to 2008. This has been a result of the change in FDA's policy of proactive, more aggressive drug safety. I want to conclude quickly on the concept of the Park Doctrine. This is another doctrine. It's in the United States. It does not apply outside the United States, and it basically makes the point that senior people in a company are responsible to make sure that the appropriate safety actions are done, which is to say, this dates back to 1975, and it basically says that a company official is responsible for making sure that there are no violations of the law, even if that official was not aware of the violation, but if he or she was in a position to prevent it or correct it and did not do so. In 2010, the FDA Commissioner, Dr. Hamburg, indicated that FDA intends to increase the appropriate use of prosecutions to hold responsible corporate officials accountable. And then the Deputy Chief Attorney for the FDA in 2010 also said very soon, and I have no one in particular in mind, some corporate executive is going to be the first in a long line. So what happened? Briefly, this was a case in the 70s in which a supermarket company had problems with rat feces in the products they sold to the public. The CEO, the chief executive officer, tried to remedy this problem after the federal government noted this, but his efforts failed. Acme was sued, and the CEO was found guilty. The case was appealed and went all the way up to the Supreme Court of the United States, which held that the law has changed things. It dispenses with the conventional previous requirement for criminal conduct. That is, somebody would be guilty only if he or she was aware of some wrongdoing. The court explained that for the greater good, the burden of compliance will rest upon the person, even if he or she is directly innocent, if he is in a responsible position to do something about a public danger. So the CEO, even though not intending to harm, is usually in a position to prevent harm, and this effort is really what society expects out of a CEO. So people exercising authority or supervision have a positive duty to remedy violations as they occur, but also a duty to implement policies and practices in advance to ensure that future violations do not occur. The accused CEO in this case claimed that he was powerless to correct or prevent the violation. That was his defense. He asserted that he had assigned this to other people within the company. The court ruled that the CEO, however, did not have to have participated directly in the situation, but that he had a responsible relationship to the violation. So what that means is that senior corporate officials, including people, say, in the Drug Safety Department, really must put in place procedures that are real and make sure that they work in order to avoid potential prosecution by FDA. In theory, this prosecution could be against the company and the individual and could lead, again, conceivably to jail time and monetary penalties. So to conclude, what does this mean to you out there? As said before, a drug safety profile is not well known at the time of approval, and we now have a major obligation to track drug safety throughout the lifespan of the drug. It's more than the formal passive tracking, waiting for adverse events to come to you. It now has to be much more proactive. Drugs are more complex. Biologics are being approved, which are much more complex and quite different from the more simple molecules we saw in the past. The risk is becoming greater, and remember, the risk is greatest at the time right after marketing and through the first decade of sales. It's telling people to take care in using new drugs, and it's telling us to be aware that new requirements are being imposed on the pharmaceutical industry, on healthcare providers, and on patients to track and minimize safety issues. So it's a brave new world. I think it is, to a certain degree, a bleak house, but there are great expectations that as we use more powerful, more potent products, we have to pay much more attention to the safety profile. So what should you do now? Know the regulations in all of your markets. Make sure your company has somebody who's paying attention to all of the standards, both preclinical and post-marketing, wherever you do your work, wherever you license out to. It's not sufficient to rely on a distributor in another country to protect your interests there. Make sure you have drug safety expertise in your company or immediately available externally. Make sure you have somebody who takes responsibility within the company for the drug safety. Be fully compliant with regulations and, ideally, do the best practices. Make sure you track this. Have a quality management system in place to assure that you are doing the job correctly. Audit your drug safety function yearly. Be conservative. Over-report. Don't hold back. Tell the government what they need to know, when they need to know it, and don't be conservative about it. Expect the unexpected. Be prepared for disaster to occur. Expect the black swan and be ready to mobilize forces to respond as appropriate. And follow the regulatory changes. The FDA changed reporting requirements for clinical trials. These go into effect at the end of this month, March 2011, and they will probably change the post-marketing requirements to some degree later this year with 6 months to comply. So within the next year or two, we will see post-marketing changes within the U.S. So on that note, I'd like to thank you for your attention.
Bart, thank you for that. That was great. And we got lots of questions. Your presentation generated quite a few questions, and we have a couple of minutes, and I can pose those to you.
Sure.
First one, why do you think class actions will become more prevalent in Europe?
Well, I can give you my very cynical New York view and say that the lawyers will make a lot more money out of it. But perhaps the less cynical view is that it seems to be an effective way to get large companies to make changes. And there has been a certain degree of slowness, it was perceived, in Europe compared to the U.S. over the years. Companies pay a lot of attention looking over their shoulder to the lawyers in the U.S., and society has in general perceived this to be a good thing. I didn't mention it, but the FDA is also using the Whistleblower Act. This is an act that encourages people to tell the FDA, tell the federal government about bad things occurring in the company. Now, obviously, this can be a reason to fire the person and have significant retribution. The FDA has now put in, or the federal government has now put in protections to encourage whistleblowers. So this is changing the way life is working within companies. These whistleblowers, if their allegations are substantiated, stand to make millions and millions of dollars from the penalties the company pays. So I think you're going to see this trend following in other countries, perhaps not as aggressively as in the U.S.
Okay, thanks. You talked about the QP. Do you anticipate that FDA is going to impose a QP-type situation for pharmacovigilance in the U.S.?
No, I don't. I don't think it'll be as explicit as the law is in Europe. If you read Volume 9A, which is the European law for the QP, it's very specific. It includes a list of the things that I showed. I don't think you'll see that in the United States, but I think you will see somebody being held responsible. And this will be a legal responsibility, and lawsuits will occur if it's not done, and penalties will occur. But I doubt if we'll ever get such an explicit requirement as in Europe.
Okay. Another question, do you see HIPAA changing to allow better safety information?
Well, actually, HIPAA allows safety information. There is a broad acceptance that HIPAA is not in play for the reporting of drug safety information. Now, I'm not a lawyer, and this obviously should be checked with your corporate attorneys, but fundamentally, drug safety information is able to be sent from the company to the federal government with a lot of information that normally under HIPAA would not be allowed. So there's a broad allowance for drug safety and public health matters under HIPAA. What you then do with it elsewhere is another story, but sending the drug safety information to the government has not been an issue. However, getting the information to the company under HIPAA has been a problem, and it has been difficult for some companies to get information about side effects from hospitals or insurance companies or other private agencies or private companies in the U.S. I don't see any changes in this in the near future, frankly, and it has been a problem for companies in terms of getting information from other companies about drug safety matters.
Okay, thanks. Another question, in your experience, do you feel that regulatory reviewers actually thoroughly read through patient safety narratives?
Good question. Yes and no. I think there are drugs that matter and drugs that matter less, and I think there are some drugs that will get very significant scrutiny. These are usually new drugs, politically hot drugs, toxic drugs, drugs in patients who are quite ill. I doubt if there is significant scrutiny for aspirin, for example, or the very old drugs. Just like everybody else, there are limited resources, there's limited time. FDA is now getting roughly 500,000 adverse events a year, and you can't read or do everything. So people have to pick and choose based upon priorities, and the real question is how companies, how governments prioritize what they look for. And that's largely a political issue.
Yeah. Okay, thanks. The park doctrine stuff was kind of scary. Do I have to worry at all since I'm not a corporate officer or anyone senior? Am I at risk?
I'm not a lawyer, so what I say is just a personal opinion. I think my guess is that the park doctrine will be used for the fairly high-up people to send a clear message to the country. But that doesn't mean that you won't get fired. It doesn't mean that there won't be a backlash that will hurt the individual lower down. So you won't go to jail or be fined, but you might have to keep your CV up to date.
All right, thanks. And then one, I'm really interested in your answer to this one. I'm going to close with this question. As the FDA rules change and these new rules are imposed, do you think as a physician that they're interfering with the practice of medicine?
Absolutely. Is that a good thing or a bad thing, though? There have been a lot of studies showing that physicians do not use drugs appropriately. Drugs have been used for contraindications. Drugs have been used with other drugs where there are clear drug interactions. So the quality of medicine is arguably not as high as it should be. And putting in restrictions on use to limit bad use of drugs is probably, theoretically, a very good thing. What we really need to do, though, is measure outcomes and see 5 years, 2 years, 10 years down the road whether this has improved the quality of care, which really is the name of the game. Are fewer people dying? Is morbidity down from drug toxicity? And are we having better outcomes? That's really the name of the game.
All right. Okay, thanks. I'm going to end the Q&A and just have a couple of wrap-up comments. For those questions that went unanswered by Dr. Cobert and also all the questions, we will be sending those to you within the next week or so. And you'll see on your screen a URL. It would be great if you could fill out our survey on the presentation. It would be very helpful. So if you take a moment to do that, that would be great. And finally, I want to thank Bart. Thanks for a really great and interesting presentation. And also thank all of our webinar participants that joined in.
Thank you.
Thank you. This concludes the presentation. Before you log off, we would very much appreciate if you could please take a moment to complete the short evaluation form. Thank you for your participation.